Okay, I believe we're good to go and start this global octo final round. In that case, I invite the first proposition speaker to open the debate. Hear, hear.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you're good to start when you're ready.
At the point where young adults are the most underrepresented voting group, when it comes to referendums or elections, we can see a problem with the present system. It causes, in simple, the youth feel disenfranchised and believe their vote will never matter at the point where the older vote is so overpowering. A change needs to be made to usher in globally governments that represent our future. In my speech, I'm going to be doing three things. First, providing some top-level framing for the round. Second, giving you our stance as side proposition. And third, answering two key questions. A, why is giving the youth's vote more weight principally justified? And B, what are the practical benefits of doing so for the country and for the future? With that being said, one point on framing. What does the youth look like? We would frame this as people of voting age, so above the age of 18 and under the age of 30, because we feel like this is generally when people are considered young and in their prime. Now, what's our stance? Two things. First, we believe it is the duty of the government to provide a world that represents their people while providing a world sustainable for the future. Therefore, whichever side can best prove that they provide representation of all eligible voters in the government progressively, then that side of the house should win today's round. But secondly, our system would give the youth equal voting power to the percentage of the population older than them. This looks like in Japan, who has a lot more older individuals than younger individuals, bringing the youth's vote proportional to the older population, even though there are less youth than elderly people. However, this does not look like Nigeria, whose youth population vastly outnumbers the older population already. We think they already have a major say in the government. We don't think that they necessarily need their votes to be weighted more because it already weighs more than the older generation. Knowing this, let's go on to the first question. Why is giving the youth's vote more weight principally justified? The youth have systemically been pushed out of politics. Giving their votes proportional weight to the older population is justified for two key reasons. First, the youth are the ones most affected by the policies made in government. Look to climate change, look to militarization. The youth are the ones that have to deal with the consequences of the older generation's actions. At the point where the older generation has taken steps towards harming our Earth's ability to sustain life, at the point where the older generation has prioritized tax cuts over equality for the LGBT community, we would say that they are not thinking for the future, but for themselves. Giving the youth a substantial say in politics forces these politicians to shift their policies towards the empirically socially liberal ideas of the younger generation. But our second principal justification for this is that the principle of democracy is being violated at the point where an entire generation of people are not represented in their government in a meaningful way. The heads of states of the world's major power players are above retirement age. Look to the United States, look to Japan, look to Germany, look to India. All nations who are ruled by representatives who wouldn't be working in any other jobs currently, but would literally be retired and collecting unemployment benefits. Why are these people in power in the first place? Because the older generation has maintained a substantial lead in voting numbers, causing the individuals to get reelected and not have to acknowledge the interests of the younger generation because the younger generation is not their biggest substantial constituent voting base. Now look towards France, a nation with an elderly population equal and proportional to the young, who elected a younger leader who takes a progressive stance on issues because he recognizes that if he wants to be put back into office and represent his constituents fairly, he's going to have to need progressive policies. Look towards the Paris Climate Accords, look towards France's extremely high quality of life. We think that these are both examples of how when you have these younger, more progressive leaders being voted on by the youth, they are going to be making policies that are going to benefit not just the present, but the future. But our second substantive, what are the practical benefits of doing so? Giving the youth a greater voice in our political atmosphere would encourage more change for the individuals who are most impacted in the future. But before we go on to the benefits of our side of the house, it's important to acknowledge what is currently going on in the status quo, two harms that currently exist. First, younger generations are less likely to vote in fear that older individuals would crowd out their advocacy for different policies and politicians. This normalizes the notion that voting is not important when voices will be crowded out in the first place. But secondly, the youth are less likely to utilize their political rights when during times of political turmoil, other perspectives matter the most. In the United States, this looks like stifling the conversation and making policies that widens the funds for welfare. Elders tend to prioritize what is impacting them right now, like retirement and tax cuts, ignoring the needs of the currently oppressed and impoverished. This ultimately results in an extremely low voter turnout for the younger generation. But secondly, and before I move on to that, I'll take your point.
But exactly like vice versa will happen on your side of the house when like we won't have policy that would actually help the elderly and actually help like the majority. How is this more democratic?
So we think that this is an inherent benefit of our model on our side of the house. When we're giving the youth, even if they have less representation or less population than the older generation, equal weight when it comes to the two, we would say that we're still having the older generation's voice matter. Their vote is still going to be important to these politicians. However, it's not going to be the deciding factor. If these politicians want to win, they're going to have to target their policies to the youth and to the elderly in tandem. We think this is inherently democratic because it gives the incentive to target both demographics. But now let's go on to the second harm that exists in the status quo. It's less representation of the youth in government. Older politicians that are currently in office need to please their voter base to keep their seats. When only individuals are voting to a large degree, we get exclusive representation of the older population. Look to the four aforementioned world powers that all have leaders above retirement age. Now, uniquely on our side of the house, we resolve and get benefits for three key reasons. First, the youth feel like their voices matter when their votes are weighted more. This is increasing voter turnout in the youth because they know that their voice has a substantial say in politics. This looks like more younger individuals working to become more politically active and understand the nuances of certain policies. But secondly, we get more progressive policies in tandem with increased representation for the youth. This is addressing major problems that are currently affecting minorities, whether this be healthcare for the transgender community, whether this be equality when it comes to the police force, whether this become any relatively socially liberal movement. We think that the youth have a vested interest in these things, and that's why they are going to be prioritizing them when they vote and when they elect their representatives. But third, uniquely, we're expanding and benefiting the beliefs of the older population because we're giving them the opportunity to understand the different perspectives that the younger generation has when new people are moving into office, when different views are being expressed in social media, and when we're allowing more conversation to be held in a meaningful way where we're prioritizing not just the older generation, but the things that are going to be impacting us in the future. It's important to acknowledge in today's debate that it does not just take place on the principle of one person, one vote, but it takes place on if these votes are harming the world. At the point where when we have had our current system, where it has resulted in noticeable detriments for our world, where it has made our world not able to sustain life in the future, where it has made our world become increasingly militarized, we think a change needs to happen. And giving the youth's population more weight when it comes to voting is going to be the solvency for that action. Vote proposition, vote for real change, vote for upholding of democratic ideals, vote proposition. Thank you.
Hey, awesome. Can I check that my panel is ready? Fantastic. I'd like to thank the first prop speaker for that fine speech and invite the first opposition speaker to continue the debate. Hear, hear.
Can you all hear me? Okay, and I would prefer vocal POIs because I will be looking at my Google Docs for like the argument, so I won't be able to see you if you would be waving or in the chat. So yeah, that would be perfect. Okay. So on our side, we stand for real democracy. We stand for every vote to matter the same and to actually represent like the wills and the needs of majority and not just like an arbitrary group that today's side of proposition proposes. So firstly, I will refute their case and then I will be moving on to our first two arguments. First one talking about the principle of democracy and how we're actually upholding it on our side of the house better. And secondly, how young people are not actually politically developed and will actually be more manipulated, which will result in like even worse political climate and decisions being made. But firstly, let's look at their case. So they were telling us how in their first argument, they were trying to portray us to this idea how like young people are like firstly they were how like young people are most affected by the policies, but we believe this is actually not the case. They just provided us two examples and they provided no concrete analysis on why specifically are like young people more affected by the policies than like the middle generation or the older generation, because we believe that majority of policies are actually there to like help all people, for example, like what are the working standards or taxes and stuff like that. So this actually affects like majority, but so we believe that like majority of policies don't actually specifically target and specifically have like bigger impacts on the on like the youth. So they have to explain to us not just by example but by like concrete analysis why are policies most affecting the youth. But secondly, they were telling us about how democracy actually failed in the status quo because like young people feel underrepresented. But on our side, we actually believe that the true point of democracy is to actually give each and every person the same amount of power in our system. But I will further be discussing this in my argument. And now let's move on to their second argument, talking about like the practical benefits of their policies. No, thank you. So firstly, they were telling us how now on their side, young people are actually more likely to vote. But we believe this is exactly, they provided us like no concrete like mechanism. Why will they actually more likely to vote? Because on our side, we believe that like, no, thank you. No, thank you. On our side, we believe that like young people will actually be like manipulated, and maybe they will like vote more. But we believe that like we believe that first they won't vote more, but Ayla will be further discussing this. But because they will feel like they already have the and secondly, we also believe that like even if they vote, they won't vote like critically and in like progressive way, because we will actually have these political candidates actually spreading propaganda and manipulating them, further discussed in my argument. And then secondly, when they responded to our POIs saying that like elders' voices will matter the same, firstly, this means that nothing changes on their side of the house if like all votes matter the same. But secondly, we also believe, no, thank you, this doesn't actually happen, because like if they want to prioritize the young voters, then like the elderly and every other generation will actually be underrepresented, because their votes will matter less, their votes won't be important, their needs and their wills actually won't be represented. And we believe this is also extremely important, because we see like elderly people struggling, especially during times of a corona crisis, when they're dying of COVID because we don't have like enough good healthcare and stuff like that. And then when they were telling us how then in their impacts, they basically just stated how we would have like more like young politicians. They provided us no mechanism here why like having more power to youth votes, no thank you, actually matter more. Why will this actually lead to having more young politicians? Because on our side, we believe that you will still have to choose like between Trump and Biden. You will still have to choose between like two like old politicians, and they provided us like no mechanism. Why will these people actually like just suddenly became young? So why would we suddenly, no thank you, actually have like young politicians? But even if this happens, we believe this is just like a smokescreen for the parties to get more votes, to actually get elected, and they won't actually do anything. But then secondly, they were telling us about like being more progressive. We don't see they have to provide us like some mechanism on why are they actually so more progressive, and why like more progressive policies will actually be like passed on their side of the house. We believe this can happen on our side of the house as well, because we still have protests, we still have young people being active, and we believe we actually have more protests on our side of the house. But now moving on to my first, I can take a POI before moving on to my arguments. Yeah.
In a situation where we see, like France, where there are more proportional youth able to vote and have a say, and we see both younger candidates and more progressive policies, why won't we see that same thing happen in the rest of the world?
Yeah, we believe this is okay when it happens in the case of France, when we don't have like the infringement on our core basis of democracy. We believe that the society should actually be run in accordance to like what majority actually wants, and not what like only the progressive young people. But we also believe that not necessarily all young people are progressive, further discussed in my argument. So we believe that yes, it might be. We believe that like these progressive liberal ideas are not necessarily the best. We believe we should actually have like we should actually have like both like different views, different ideologies actually represented, which actually like provides us a true democracy. So, but now moving on to my argument, talking about true democracy. So why is actually the point of democracy? We believe it actually means that all people are equal in deciding about important things regarding them. So we believe all voters are equally important. And political decisions actually have an impact on all people in the society. Therefore, everyone should actually have, and we believe that it is hypocritical from today's side of proposition to say that they are actually defending democracy, but then they don't give all people the same amounts of power in deciding what measures will be taken that will, no thank you, that will have detrimental impacts on their lives. So we believe political decisions actually impact all people, but can never, but like political decisions can never be okay for every single individual, meaning that in order to get best results, in order to get most people possible happy and satisfied, is by actually doing what's the best for the majority. And this can only happen on our side when we actually give every single individual the same amount of power in decision-making processes. And because of that, we believe we actually have better democracy, better representation of what people actually want on our side of the house. And we believe this is extremely important because like democracy is foundation of our society. We believe that when we are all equal, when we all have like equal power, this is actually like one of, and what prop is actually doing today is that they are arbitrarily prioritizing one group of people, and they never prove to us why specifically are these young people so more affected by different policies, and why are they so, like a homogenous group that should deserve like having more power, never provided from today's out of proposition. But now moving on to my second argument, talking about how young people don't have enough experience and can be easily manipulated, which will directly harm our democratic processes. So firstly, why are young people more easily manipulated? Because they haven't been around for long, they haven't dealt with so many problems, and they have way less experience than like older generations. They are more impressionable. They're firstly more impressionable because they haven't figured out their identity yet. They are still struggling to find themselves. They're less confident in their identity, in what they believe and what they want, and therefore they're way more likely to follow certain like idols. And we see this happening when like teens and like young adults are actually like following different trends and stuff, and they're like actually trusting their influencers and stuff like that. They're more likely to fall into this group mentality and not actually critically think about the decisions they make in their lives, meaning that so this will actually result in them firstly following the group, and secondly being way less critical about the situation that is going on. But secondly, how will political candidates and parties actually use this to get more votes? Because now the youth votes will actually matter more, they will have more power, so the parties will actually focus more on the youth. But we believe they won't actually like do what the youth actually wants, even if they want like what they want, even if they want are like positive stuff such as like tackling climate change. We believe that they actually want to like gain power, they actually want to like be elected and stuff, so they're more likely to just like so what they are going to do, they're going to manipulate the youth because they know they're more impressionable, so they will spread the propaganda. They're more likely to like get influencers to promote it. They're more likely to have certain propaganda on social media, and but we already have everyone specific, and this will result in everyone specifically targeting the youth and specifically giving them even more like fake information and messing with their critical thinking and stuff like that. And this will actually result in firstly even young people seeing even more propaganda, having even less of their own opinions, even less critical thinking, and second, which is extremely problematic for our democracy. And secondly, also we will have problematic voting results because this won't represent the will of all people and won't even represent the will of the youth. Vote up.
All right, if my panel is ready. Fantastic. I'd like to thank the first top speaker for that fine speech and invite second prop to continue the round. Here.
Am I audible? Perfect. In today's speech, I'll be doing three things. First off, we're going to go off some like key misconceptions made by side opposition before addressing their strategic errors in today's debate. Then we'll go over the substantives, both presented by proposition and then opposition in today's debate, do a little bit of rebuttal and rebuilding before introducing you our third substantive, a safer society. But first, let's get into some key misconceptions here. First, they tell you democracy's one principle is to represent everybody. Recognize it's to represent every single person equally, at the point that we're like disenfranchising youthful voters because they've been told for so long that their opinions do not matter, the same way side opposition tells you they shouldn't be able to vote or have much sway in an election because they haven't had as many life experiences. Recognize the entire point of having the entire population be able to like give their opinions and vote is so that we see all of those different points of view and actually work as a government to protect our society and give them like the future they need in order to exist both comfortably and successfully and sustainably. At the point that we fail to do that in the status quo, it is time for a change. Some key strategic errors here were that they refused to engage with a model that creates like proportional representation, but still doesn't disenfranchise youthful individuals. This is the model we're running in today's debate, because when we look towards countries like France, who have this proportional voting, we see younger candidates being elected. They're not in their 70s, 80s, or 60s. They are instead like 30 to 40-year-olds who actually have an invested interest in looking towards the future because they'll still be alive to see it. Then we also see that individuals tend to vote for more progressive policies, like France, when they have many protests every year going over like low gas prices, but also like equal rights for individuals, both in their country and internationally. and climate change agreements because they recognize that that's an existential crisis that we want to see in the future. However, not every country has that type of equal voting or that type of equal population. When you look to the United States, you see this massive like inverted triangle of a population pyramid where the youth are hardly ever represented in politics because they're disenfranchised and never given like the encouragement to do so, nor do they believe that their vote ever matters in a society where the vast majority of people are like over retirement age or approaching it. We also see that same thing happening in like India and Japan, where you have a massive population of older individuals, but you don't have the youth who are going to be affected by those policies every single day for the rest of their life actually having a say in it. Side opposition seems to disagree. I'll take your point.
So when you have like, when you were trying to tell us that you actually have real democracy, when you would like even these balances of like youth and like older people, we believe that if you have like 20% of youth in the population, therefore the youth should actually fit 20% of like say in what is actually going to happen, not like 50 as you're trying to propose. This is not real democracy.
So side opposition here wants you to believe that the future doesn't matter if it doesn't serve the elderly. Recognize that 20% of the youth population will grow as they get older. They're going to be the ones affected in the long run. At the point that we give individuals who have a higher chance of like dying from asphyxiation instead of assassination in our government, we've created an issue there because they're no longer invested in representing us. They're only invested in representing their own interests because they want to retire comfortably instead of making sure that like the millennials of today's society have enough money to buy a house in their economy. Recognize the injustices done to the youth and work to fix them. That is the only way we can create a fair society that actually represents the people that hold the most stake in it. Now, let's go ahead and analyze some points brought to us by side opposition. They give you 5 main things in today's debate. The first is that it's like people won't vote progressively. We're never going to see these policies. Recognize that's not true. Whether you look towards TikTok, protests, Instagram, or you look basically outside any kind of government, you see that the youth are invested in making changes. They're the ones bringing attention to like Uyghur Muslim incarceration camps. They're the ones bringing attention to climate change, and they're the ones who are bringing attention to Black Lives Matter. It's not the older population. They have no invested interest in making sure minorities or individuals who don't think like them get the things they need in today's society. Let's go ahead and analyze the fact that most of the older population is only in it for themselves, but not every single one of those elderly individuals are equal or represented. However, policies that these individuals want work towards bringing equality there, whether it's like affirmative action in terms of like able to get a job, whether it's like climate change to make sure that individuals aren't suffering on the streets or dying because their forests, roads, oceans are completely blocked or polluted. We want a society in which we can work towards fixing these issues. We don't see it in the status quo. It's time we make a change. Then they tell you that the youth are not affected by any of these policies. Recognize that's not true in any way, shape, or form. If the youth are the ones growing up in a society that has completely disenfranchised them, they are the ones affected. They'll be the ones growing up and living in an economy that's been damaged by tax reforms only targeted to help the older population. They're the ones growing up in an economy that in some places refuse to give them free college or education and force them to go into massive amounts of debt in order to pay it off. They're the population that's going to be put at a disadvantage in the future if we don't work towards like reducing the amount of CO2 emissions we have and hurting us. We think the old individuals still matter to some degree, yes, but we think that their representation should be proportional to the people who have a higher interest and stake in today's government because they are the ones most affected by any policy passed. At the point that we give you like this proportional model that they don't really engage with, where we tell you that this vote weightage will be based on like proportional population. We want those youth votes to matter just as much as older individuals so that none of these politicians can focus just on, but they have to have points and policies that reach every individual and like cross the bridges to both sides so that everyone is represented. And we see those more progressive policies the same way we do in France. Then they tell you that like these individuals see more protests on side opposition. Recognize that's not true. If individuals feel like their politicians listen to them, you see more protests like you do in France, like you do when we started to get like younger politicians here in the US with AOC. We saw more people getting involved because they felt like those protests and like problems and petitions would actually have someone with an ear ready to listen. Then they tell you that they're going to be manipulated. Recognize that's true on both sides of the house. Politicians have an invested interest in like making people believe
Yeah,
in
why?
them. We don't think that that is going to change on either side of the house. It happens to older individuals when they only get their news off like TikTok, Facebook, and other social medias. It happens when the youth do the same. We don't think manipulation is a key issue that anyone can win on, and it's definitely not going to be solved on either side of the house. Then they tell you that like the last principle we have to uphold here is one person, one vote. I think we've spent enough time on why democracy deserves to represent the people most affected. Now let's go ahead and go on to the substantives we brought you in today's debate. First, we tell you that like the younger are affected because they are the majority. It is principally just because they have like the most impact and the most benefits seen by policy. They deserve to have an equal say. Then we tell you practically, they will not be inclined to be manipulated. They'll be more likely to vote. They'll be more likely to vote progressively. These are societies we want to see. We don't receive much engagement on like why it's not true. They just say our analysis is flawed without actually engaging. But let's go ahead and go on to our third substantive here, a safer society. The world is on the brink of existential crises when it comes to human rights and climate change. If we don't make a change now, we'll never see it. At the point that youth are proven to vote more progressively, are literally like wanting to create a better society for themselves, we see a safer one when we have everyone across the board recognized. Even in places with like super high elderly population, those actions affect the global stage. It is time for the youth to be able to take those reins and create a safer society so that we're not all struggling. Vote side proposition, we care about the younger generations.
All right, if my panel is ready, fantastic. I'd like to thank Second Prop for that fine speech and invite Second Op to continue the debate. Hear, hear.
Okay, I'm sorry. I would like vocal POIs because I'm going to look at my Google documents. So first, in my speech, I'm going to rebut their argument, and then I'm going to reestablish our case, and then I'm moving on to my third argument about less youth in politics. So they were talking about that people would vote more on their side, but if someone doesn't want to vote, or if someone doesn't have a will to vote or isn't interested in politics, how will your change that the votes is going to count more? How is that going to change? How are you going to convince them that they are going to be magically interested in politics, but if they are not? You were also telling us that they that we said that politics wouldn't change anything. We need to protest other forms of being politically active. We only said that we need more protests, and that like it's not important that politics won't change if you have more youth votes. You were also talking about that old people are going to die faster because they have diseases and everything, but and youth will live longer and it will affect us. But what about those people, those young people that have diseases? What about those? Are they going to be included in your decisions? No, no, thank you. You also said that our point, you agreed that when Masha asked you a question, you agreed, but suddenly you went to the future. You were talking about how it will affect us, but we have 4 years of terms. If you want to vote someone, you would just wait 4 years and then you would vote them again, or like you will vote a new one. It doesn't matter if you are old. In 4 years, you are probably not going to die. They are going to just you can vote again because you have 4-year terms. No, thank you. And majority of politicians aren't based on your age. you also told that youth is a majority, that youth is very important, but you were talking about that youth doesn't vote today, that they don't vote, but you were kind of saying that they were oppressed, but they are not. They just don't have interest in voting. They just don't want to vote. They don't feel the need to vote. No, thank you. That's why they are expressing themselves by protesting, because I think on our side, we would have more protests, because on our side, they would feel they would feel like they need to protest, because on your side, like I'm going to explain that in my third argument, why we would have more protests. They also agreed with our first argument about the principle of democracy, and it's important that democracy stands in the society, because it is our foundation of society.
Point.
Yes.
In a situation where the youth feel like their only avenue to political action is protesting, how can you say a democracy is standing for them?
They are because they don't feel, because they aren't. I'm going to explain that furtherly in my third argument, but to answer your question is that they do vote. Those people who protest vote, but if on your side they're going to have votes that are counting more, why would they protest if they don't feel the need to do it? Now I'm moving on to my third argument. No, thank you. Less youth in politics. So my thesis for this argument would be, by implanting this motion, even fewer youth will be involved in politics. So I have 2 points in this argument. My first point would be nothing more being done for youth in politics, because the country will only show like it did something, but actually nothing happened. They just gave a group a little more voting power. The country will eventually stop paying attention to that, because it's not that important anymore. And second, passivization. Just a second. You have a limited amount of political power or energy. When you cast a vote now, you have done everything that others did. Therefore, you are likely to do more and will go protesting, expressing your opinion out loud, and etc. But when you know that your vote counts more than others, you don't have the incentive to go to a protest or express yourself express yourself so much, because you will believe you already did more than others. You don't need to do anything more. Surely the most passionate will still protest, but the percentage of that is bigger on our side when they want to do more. Now we will take your POI.
I think it's important to recognize the people that protest are not because they feel their vote isn't being represented, but because there are injustices. If the people that they elect are still committing these injustices, there will still be protests.
If people protest because they aren't heard by the government, but if they aren't heard by the government now, why would they be heard on your side? They're just going to vote more, but they aren't going to be heard. Like I explained in my argument, my first point, nothing is going to be done for youth in politics, because even now they are still protesting. But what will on your side change? What would the government do on your side even if on our side they are still doing nothing, even if you have protests? So we believe that protests aren't because they aren't enough voters. It is because you are unheard by the government, because you don't feel heard by the government. And impacts of my case would be that less youth in politics, not so much political representation of younger generations. And with that, I conclude my speech.
Brilliant. If my panel is ready. Fantastic. I'd like to thank the second op speaker for that fine speech and invite third prop to continue the round. Hear, hear.
Can everyone hear me? For POIs, if it's okay, I like to have like visual POIs, so just like wave your hand and I might take it or not. To the point in which these younger individuals have to take days off from work, take days off from school, and have to go out on the streets and protest for Black Lives Matter. To the point in which these young individuals have to go out in the streets and protest for changes when it comes to climate change policies. To the point in which these individuals have to go out in the street and advocate for LGBTQ rights. We think, do they have to go to that extreme to feel like they are being heard from the government? We think the government is ultimately failing them. In my speech, I'll be doing a few things. First, going over the major assumptions made by team opposition. Second, the two key clashes of today's debate. First, principally, is it justified to weigh the youth votes more? And second, on pragmatics, who is best for the representation in government? Then, judges, I'll be giving some weighing onto why ultimately team proposition has won today's debate. But now let's go on to the assumptions, two very key assumptions that team opposition made. First, understand their characterization of these young individuals. They characterize these individuals as impressionable. I specifically think that individuals coming out of college, individuals who are shaped by backgrounds, who are shaped by education, are not just like 8-year-olds in which you say, hey, this politician's great, you should vote for them. I think specifically they have the same educational system, just like these older individuals, the same background. However, they are shaped by what is going on in the status quo, and they're also shaped by what is going to go on in the future. We specifically think that this characterization was very wrongful. But secondly, they talk about how youth can wait for the next term. Understand, when youth are already disincentivizing from voting in the status quo, I don't specifically think these individuals will just magically vote for the next term, because it just doesn't happen that way. When we have older politicians already in government, we see even a cycle of older politicians in the next term, because at the end of the day, when these young individuals are not voting, all we see is like older generations individuals are the only ones who are getting the major representation in government. With that, let's go on to our first key question of today's debate. Principally, is it justified to weigh the youth votes more? What did they tell you in their first substantive argument? They talked about the principle of democracy, because they somehow think that the true point of democracy is giving everyone an equal voice by just giving them one specific vote, and they think that what the majority wants is what truly matters. We have three responses to this. First, at the end of the day, the point of democracy is representation of the populace. It's not just explicitly giving everyone one single vote. Because at the end of the day, when you see the impact that you don't get representation of other minorities, when you don't get representation of the youth, they're not even upholding their principle of democracy. Because understand, we told this in our first substantive argument, society is systematically pushed from these policies. They're systematically pushed from voting because they don't think their voices matter when all we have is like older individuals who are voting, who are constantly crowding out their own voices. We can talk about climate change. We already have, and specifically in the United States, president, Congress members who are specifically against climate change, who are only against the non-renewable industries, and they have to please their voter base, which are these older individuals, because at the end of the day, they don't specifically care about the effects of climate change. Who do care about the effects of climate change are these younger individuals. When we're not voting, we don't get progressive policies into these governments. But secondly, we best uphold equal representation. Look at the framing in the beginning of our round. We think that this is going to be proportional to the population of a specific nation. So understand, in nations like France, when we have equal representation, when the votes are actually weighed the same, we don't specifically think this motion is needed. But to the point in which in the US, to the point in which in Japan, we see the older representation is far greater than younger representation, we specifically think that their votes should be weighed more. Because at the end of the day, we think we should have equal representation of elders and youth. And if that means in specific countries we're going to weigh the youth vote more, we think that is principally justified. Why is that? Let's go on to our first substantive argument when we talk about the principle. We think at the end of the day, young individuals are the ones that are most impacted. When we talk about climate change and how US never takes discussion, US never takes active action for climate change, we can look specifically towards France when we have equal representation. When youth are actually voting, we see more active action for climate change. We see the climate accords being established and actually be effectively carried out in France. That's what we want around the world. That's why we're proposing. Our second key clash then today is practically who has best representation in the government. Because explicitly, if you're just having the same votes, yet you don't see those impacts being carried out for those terms, when you don't see the impacts of these individuals actually getting policies, I don't think there's any effective change or any benefits for anyone in team opposition side. But before I go on, sure, I'll take your point.
Your whole case is based on the idea that when you have more representation, you actually have more young voters. But what you're proposing today is like just giving more power to the young voters. You're not proposing like having more young politicians.
And I will be talking about that in my second speech of how incentivizing these younger individuals from voting will get more progressive and younger politicians in office. What did they tell you in their second substantive argument? They talked about how young voters are easily swayed, how these are impressionable, and politicians are tricking the youth. This argument is very problematic for two main reasons. First, these are not 8-year-olds who are just going to follow what every individual tells you. We think they are shaped by education. We think they are shaped by background. If an individual is shaped by in those oppressional situations when they're suffering from poverty, I don't specifically think talking about tax cuts and saying, hey, look, tax cuts are very good, I think you should vote for this politician, is going to change that individual's minds. Understand, at the end of the day, we think this is a unique group of individuals that are facing the policies of these older generations. They know the systematic problem in the status quo. We think they're the best group to characterize it and actually address the problem. But secondly, we characterize this as more progressive. Individuals are already politically active to the point in which they think their vote doesn't count. That is a problem. When individuals, like they said in their third substantive argument, they already talked about and conceded how these individuals actually care about the problems in the world, how they recognize that something is wrong in the status quo, to the point that people are protesting. In the US, people are protesting for Black Lives Matter. We specifically think they're conceding that these individuals are actually aware of the issues. We don't specifically think that protesting should be the only avenue given to these individuals, because at the end of the day, they conceded that these individuals don't feel right with the representation. They don't feel like they're even heard by the government. Understand, look towards France. Population is proportion, we see even more change. But on our practical, we told you in our second substantive argument, they fail to adequately engage with the problems in the status quo. Why is this? We told you 3 main reasons. First, young people are less likely to vote. This normalizes the notion that these votes do not matter. The younger generation's votes do not matter, because at the end of the day, when they're the most vulnerable group, they're the ones who are most impacted. That's like taxes versus welfare systems. We think older generations are more incentivized to just keep in within their own benefits, because retirement funds is more important to these older generations than to younger individuals. We think at the end of the day, when we have equal representation, when we have differentiating viewpoints, we have even more progressive policies that are moderate to everyone in the status quo. But secondly, we have less representation. When we see a cycle of old politicians that are constantly be voting out by old generations, we don't even see more politicians and newer politicians incentivized to enter office, because they'll just be crowded out by these older politicians. We think we uniquely solve this for 2 key ways. First, we have bigger turnout. We see more individuals who are politically active, but rather instead of protesting, they're going into these election booths. They're actually voting for their same politicians. And secondly, when you have these individuals voting, we think they're more likely to vote for these progressive politicians and newer politicians, not the same politicians who kept ignoring their discussions, ignoring their advocacy, and ignoring what they think is most important in the status quo. But thirdly, we're expanding the horizon of elders when they understand the viewpoints. When we have newer politicians entering office, it's not the same older politicians that are trying to represent these people. At the end of the day, they're giving one vote. However, we're giving the best representation in government. So proud to propose.
All right, if my panel is ready. Fantastic. I'd like to thank third prop for that fine speech and invite third op to continue the debate here.
Okay, just before I start, for the POIs, I would prefer if you could just raise your hand, and if I don't see you, you can do it vocally. So I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The side of proposition doesn't realize that just providing some examples and stating out the facts doesn't make it true. Throughout their whole speeches, they never provided this analysis and mechanisms why anything on their side happens. Throughout their whole speeches, they were just stating this France example and how they're more progressive. Never explained why this actually happens and why not just France is a unique example or something like that. So throughout my speech, I'm going to firstly point out some things that they have strategically missed. Then I'm going to go to 2 main clashes, firstly on the principal ground, and secondly, what actually happens to the youth in politics. Now, going to what they have actually done wrong. They have tried to portray to you how youth is so oppressed and therefore they need more votes. They need to have an equal vote as the older generation. But if the youth is so oppressed, we have challenged them in our first speech. Why exactly the youth? Why not LGBTQ people having more weight in voting? Why not Black people having more weight in voting? If they want to have somebody that is already oppressed having more weight in voting, Why not giving to every minority? Why give it only to the these young people? And furthermore, they have tried to portray to thank you, how they're actually getting more progressive, but they never clearly showed us why do they believe that we should get some more progressive. If they want to get some more progressive, just abolish the Conservative Party. Why giving the youth more vote or whatever if they want to get progressive, if that is their only goal that they are trying to achieve? So now moving on to the first clash on the principal ground. They believed that democracy is important, and they try to portray to you how they are achieving more of it because everybody is equally represented. But the point is, if you are 20% of the whole population, you count 20% in the elections. That is the point of democracy. They agreed that democracy is important, but then said how youth is not represented and they need to be represented. Once again, why are they not giving this to every minority? Why is only giving this to the youth? And furthermore, the true democracy means that everybody has an equal vote. If you are only 10% of the nation, actually, you only count 10% in the democratic election because this is democracy. You get the same vote as everybody else. This does not mean that the minorities actually get more vote or whatever. And then again, we have tried to portray to you how they will live longer and how they are actually more impacted by all those things that are passed. But once again, we have challenged them. Will the youth with diseases also get this? They have tried to portray to us how actually old people will die sooner, therefore they don't deserve so much power in the politics. Firstly, they have to acknowledge that these terms in national elections only last for 4 years or something like that. It does not mean that once you will vote, this will be going on forever for the future. You can change it once you grow, once you actually have, and you can always no thank you, vote for the same politician again or whatever. And furthermore, if they believe that we should actually look for the future, will they exclude the youth with diseases? Will they exclude a young person that has cancer and will die in 2 years maybe? They never provided us why. Yes, I will take your POI. You have to unmute yourself.
We provided this link at the point where we're making their votes matter equally. Voters and politicians are going to have to target the elderly and the youth if they want to win. They're not simply going to be able to target the elderly to get into office like they've done empirically in the past.
Okay, now you can see the side of opposition doesn't realize what democracy actually is. They have tried to portray you how now they will target everybody equally, but the point is that you have to target the majority of population. We want to look to what actually suits the majority the most. It does not mean that you will always get 50-50, but you have to appeal to the majority in order to win in democracy. So now moving on to the second clash about youth in politics. They have tried to portray to you 2 points in this clash. Firstly, who actually achieves more, and secondly, who actually gets more representation or whatever. So firstly, who actually achieves more. They have tried to portray to you how on their side there are still all these protests and they are still hurt and something like that. But let me just point out in their second or third speech, they have said that the youth protests because they believe that they are not represented. And then again, they stated that they will now go, that the youth doesn't protest because they don't feel represented, but then said us that they do not vote because they don't feel represented. If they will suddenly realize that they are represented and go voting, why would they protest again? Why would they protest if, as the side of proposition is saying, they would believe that their vote matters the same and that they would actually have all this power? They have never showed us this is a contradiction on their side of the house. Would they protest or not? They have to realize that they have made this crucial mistake. And furthermore, let me just now point again why protests are more effective. We can see that in the protests, the government actually has to appeal and change quickly in order for the protest to stop, as we have already told you. But the side of proposition wants actually changing by doing the voting and stuff like that. No, thank you. But the point they do not realize is that we are talking about national elections. We are only talking which candidate out of 4 or 2 or whatever you will decide. We are not talking about referendums or stuff like that. We are just talking which politician will you get. And furthermore, they have never proved to us why actually voting is better. They have just stated, oh, when you vote, you can change stuff, it will get more progressive, and therefore it is better. But they have never showed to us. But we have shown to you that protests are more effective because the government is forced to actually change in order to get something done to stop the protests and so on. So now going back to the second point, who actually gets more representation of the youth. We have tried to portray to you how they will actually have more representation because they will try also to appeal to the young generation. But this is completely false. Why would they get more of this just because they want to appeal? And once again, we have to realize that the younger generations are way easier to manipulate. They have tried to portray to you, oh, old people also use social media, old people also use TikTok, and therefore they are also manipulated. They don't realize that who majority uses social media is the youth. The youth mostly uses just a second social media and not evenly spread throughout the whole age groups. Yes, I will take your POI.
At the point where the voters are able to hold these politicians accountable. So if these politicians are tricking them and not using their policies, they will not get reelected in the future. You have to acknowledge that the politician is beholden to their constituents, not simply able to lie to them.
Okay, you see once again the mistake on the side of proposition. They have tried to portray to you how actually the presidents appeal to what is going on in the election and actually change themselves in order to be elected again. But we can see that this simply isn't going on in the status quo. They just on and on make these political ideas and make these promises what they will actually change, but most of them don't get done. Most of them are not actually put in the effect. So we can see that the politicians don't actually care so much about the voting. They only care about the protests when they are actively charged, when they are actively targeted by a certain group. As we have already told you, that protests are much better than everything else. So now moving on to the point about manipulation. We have told you that there will be even more propaganda to the young people throughout the social media, through influencers and so on. But we have again tried to show you how they are not actually some 8-year-olds, and once again how this happens to older generation as well. Firstly, the social media is mostly used by the younger generation, and in order for them to be manipulated through social media, we can clearly see that this happens to the younger generation mostly. And secondly, they have never negated our point with this. They have just said, oh, they are not some 8-year-olds. Yes, even if you are not 8-year-olds, you can still be manipulated. Even if you are 20, you can still be manipulated. They don't realize that when you are young, when you are youth, you actually change. You aren't politically grown yet, and therefore you are more prone to manipulations, more prone to follow what your friends or partner or family says or something like that. So now what have I showed you throughout the speech? We can firstly show you how democracy is important and how every vote should count the same. Secondly, we have showed you that we actually achieve more with protests. And thirdly, we have showed you that we are much better because we are actually making everybody equal and making the changes that are supposed to happen by democratic processes. If you believe in democracy, please vote for the opposition.
All right, if my panel is ready. Fantastic. I'd like to thank the third opposition speaker for that very fine speech. And we're now ready to move to the reply speeches, which are 4 minutes long, starting with the opposition. So I invite the op reply here.
Okay. So on our side, we provided you the principle of why is it so important to uphold democracy in our society. But secondly, I will be discussing like the practical impacts and who actually wins on this clash. But firstly, we would also like, so firstly, let's talk about the principle. So we provided you a like unique analysis on why democracy only works when like each individual has the same amount of power as every other individuals in the society. Because like democracy can only be achieved when all the wills and the needs of every single individuals are actually taken account when we are making like political decisions. But we have to know that like not non-political decisions can actually like please every single individual in the society. Therefore, the best way we can do, the best way to achieve democracy and the most people happy and pleased is to actually give each and every person the same amount of power in like deciding process to actually like please the majority. And this only happens on our side of the house. And what they provided you on today's side of proposition is this idea that like young people are actually underrepresented and stuff like that. But then in their second, they actually conceded to our principle and they just they basically agreed to it that like they don't have the same, that they actually give like young people more power in the society, so they don't actually have equal representation. They basically conceded to that, and then they said that it's important because of the future. So they basically shifted their team line to like focusing more on the future. And we believe that even if like decisions right now we believe that decisions made right now impact all people in like a similar amount, and that young people are not actually more affected by the policies as we're trying to portray by just using like 2 simple examples. We believe this is not enough, and we actually believe we win on the principle already. So if you manage to prove to you that we have that none of the teams actually win on the clash of the practical, we still win this debate because we win on the principle. But now moving on to the practical. So they firstly came up and told us that like the problem in the status quo is that like young people don't vote, and why they don't vote because they don't feel represented. And if you don't feel represented, giving your vote more power actually won't actually solve this problem, because they phrase the problem completely wrong, because their policy is to actually give more power to the voters to like one single vote. This doesn't mean that like we will suddenly have like more suddenly have like more young people in politics. They completely they fail to give us like the mechanism on why, when we have like more people, why will this actually lead to like more people actually voting, and why will this actually lead us to have like more like young politicians. Because as Laura already talked to you about, like if the government right now is not listening to the firstly, if like the government if these people don't feel represented, they go and they protest. And what happens on their side of the house, they told us that like when they don't feel what happens on their side of the house, that they will now feel represented as they were trying to portray us, but then so they won't have the need to actually protest. So they have to decide either if they have protests on their side of the house or if they don't. Because if the problem is that people don't feel represented and then go to protest, then they cannot have like protests and having more votes on their side of the house. And on our side, Laura already talked to you about how protests are actually more effective way of actually expressing and of actually achieving like some changes in the society, because this is the only way that the government actually feels threatened, the only way to actually achieve something in our society, because like voting simply doesn't work. Like our democracy is false and stuff like that. But when they were trying to tell us that like they actually have like similar representation of elderly and young people, we believe that if they want to have this idea, they cannot then claim the benefits of having more like youth represented. So they have to decide if they are prioritizing youth or if they are prioritizing or if they have like equal democracy. They have to decide. We still don't know. But then we provided you this idea of manipulation, and they just said that they're not some 8-year-olds and stuff like that. That we had like a mischaracterization. But we provided you advanced analysis on why is this actually so. Because yes, old people can be like manipulated to a certain extent, but like on a comparative, young people are way more impressionable than like elderly, because they already have like some experiences, they already have been through some things in life. I talked to you about this in my second argument. And because what will happen on their side of the house is like politicians actively targeting, actively trying to manipulate young people into like voting for them, and nothing will actually change, because like they won't have any like mechanisms to actually hold these politicians accountable. We believe that the only way to solve problems is to through democracy and actually like protest and stuff like that, vote up.
Right, if my panel is ready, I'd like to thank the op reply for that fine speech and invite the prop reply to conclude the debate as a whole. Here.
Am I audible? Perfect. In today's society, at the point that the young are rampaging on the streets protesting for Black Lives Matter, and we haven't seen any type of political action, at the point that we get more change when we have younger individuals who appeal to the younger population, and we see more change when it comes to climate change and the Paris Climate Accords, we believe protesting was not a smart stance for side opposition to take in today's debate. Let's go ahead and do a couple things in my last speech of today. First, we'll be answering the question, who is affected and why does it matter? Before going into some key clashes today that win us both the principle and the practical, including what is democracy and how does it weigh up to representation? How is progression less desirable than tradition? And does protest work better than voting? Let's go ahead and analyze the principle of like who is affected in today's debate. Recognize, they try and tell you that we deregulated like the old people to saying they're going to die sooner. We tell you that they should not be the deciding factor when it comes to getting someone elected. As we've told you down the bench, these younger individuals will live in a society whose choices were made for a lot longer than an elderly or an older population will. They and their future generations that come from them are the ones that face climate change, are the ones that face human rights abuses, and are the ones who face militarization. At the point they have a more vested interest in the future, we believe a democracy has a principal burden to uphold their representation, which brings us to our question, democracy versus representation. When we see democracy, one person, one vote, we see a mob rule of elder or older individuals who want like policies that affect themselves. But as side opposition told you in their reply speech, we believe everyone should have equal representation in the government. When it comes to the fact that these younger individuals, these youths, are systematically oppressed with their expression, we believe that their opinions and their points of views deserve to have representation in our government. At the point that we routinely see people over the age of retirement deciding our futures, it's time our voice mattered. Today, they refuse to engage with our actual nuanced model here, which is we want the youth to have a proportional voice to the elderly so that that perspective is heard in the government. We're not saying the youth matter more, we're saying they should matter equally as much as the elderly. That way, all of these policies have to affect both of them in a progressive, beneficial manner. They refuse to engage, they lose the clash on democracy versus representation. we win. Then when it comes to progression versus tradition, who creates better, more sustainable change? We do on-side proposition, because we've shown you that these youths are more liberal leaning and more politically active. We show you this through the protests they're using in the status quo because the government doesn't listen to this. We show you this through literal stats that people who live in more proportional countries tend to vote more with the youth social ideas because they recognize they have a more vested interest. We show you this common sense all down the bench. We see that the youth vote more progressive because those are things they have a vested interest in. We win when it comes to progressive being better than traditional values of the elderly because these youth will be impacted by it for a lot longer, and these progressive ideals tend to deal with a lot more equality than simply tax cuts and welfare funding. Then we went on the last clash of today, which is, does their model work or does ours? They tell you protesting is enough, and in our side of the house, we would lose the amount of protests we have. We think that's a good thing because it means that the government is not committing massive human rights abuses, is not ignoring an entire population of their country. If we have less protests, it means the government's doing something right and people have had their voices heard. People all across the aisle protest when a government refuses to engage and listen to them. If we have less protests, we see more engagement. Side opposition proves our point. If people can vote and have those votes matter, we see more representation. We see more progressive ideals. We see a healthier, safer, better society that represents all. Vote side proposition, we care about real change.